always tell people that degree in religion and personality that I needed more of both. So it was it was the hope anyway. I should probably, yeah, yeah. Well, anyway, so you all are the brave ones to come for this topic of sexuality and spirituality. And let me put it in context a little bit. The first course that I started teaching, actually, when I started teaching at Louisville Seminary, that's how you pronounce it, Louisville, was a course in sexuality and pastoral practice. And I remember members of the board coming up to me and saying, now, what is this that you're doing? Practice for sexuality? But, you know, I think any of us that have been in congregations know that sexuality is something that's not something the church talks about easily. And on the other hand, as a pastor, I knew that it was a very important topic for pastoral care, and both for individuals and families and so forth. So one of the other things that I quickly discovered was that though I was teaching, at that point it was more often young adults, they thought they knew more than they did. And that could be true of adults at any point, I imagine. But so I've been interested in these issues for a long time. And this particular focus on sexuality and spirituality that we're going to be focusing on today arises from a kind of intuition, which I think I'll be interested at the end of this evening where you find yourselves, that ways that distortions on one side or the other of this conjunction of sexuality and spirituality will create distortions for the other. So in other words, if we find challenges and distortions, as I think almost always with the stereotypes that accompany our gender rules and roles, then that's likely to complicate how our spiritual experience. Because, as we'll talk about tonight, how we understand ourselves has everything to do with how we experience God, and how we experience God informs how we imagine ourselves. So when there are distortions on either side, the complications abound. And that's really the focus of tonight. No big secret and no hot tips. But on the other hand, I hope we have fun. I was telling Jenna, I've been looking forward to the conversation because usually, at least when I do this with students, we end up having a good time. So that's my goal. And so let me start with this claim. And this is something that I think once you think about it, might not have been something that you'd thought about before. But epistemology, is the study of how we know something and how we know it to be true. So all of our knowing is through the lens of embodied experience. If you think about that, there's no other way to know. So paying attention to that embodied experience is important because it will shape how we know. And part of, so I'm going to build on that idea that we can't know in some disembodied way. So to the extent that our experience of gender, of sexuality, and there are two different things, we'll talk about that, it is shaped by history, by context, by our own religious beliefs, by our families, and so forth. And that inevitably then becomes part of the lens, if you will, for how we make sense out of other things. So anything we know through the context, through the experience of our embodied life. That can be plus and it can be minus. So one of the other ideas, now that was an epistemological idea, this is a theological one, that we can only know God then through our bodies. And this is an insight from James Nelson, whom you've had here to talk about another topic, an ethicist who's retired, I guess, in about 5 years ago, something like that. But Dr. Nelson is one of the most important, from the mid-20th or late 20th century up until recently, prolific ethicist, and had several volumes that had to do with ethical dimensions of sexuality, talking about masculinity in particular. But this was one of his early insights, which has really shaped both pastoral care and ethics. And I think I'll be interested, what do you think? That we can only know God through our bodies. If we can only know in an embodied way, can't know in some disembodied way, we don't come that way, then the only way we can know God is through our embodied experience. So paying attention to that embodied experience obviously has implications for our spirituality, for how we know God. And to the extent that we might encounter experiences or distortions in that embodied life, it's very likely to have implications for our spirituality, for how we're able to know God. And that's why I think the topic is so important. And then finally, this is my own, as a pastoral theologian and a pastoral counselor, how we feel about ourselves and who and how we imagine God to be are intimately related. So I say that after many years of working with clients, working with parishioners. Maybe this rings true for you in your own experience or experience of friends, that when we have some experience, a positive experience, let's say, of in our relational life, in our own life, it's more likely, if we've come to feel positively about ourselves, it's more likely that we'll also imagine more positively about God. If we have a negative experience of ourselves, if we don't feel good about who we are, it's very likely that we have a hard time imagining that God does. And that's to my mind, a really important thing to hold on to, partly because it's a sign of hope to me. That is, if we can begin to positively affect how, let's say, you no doubt, either from your own experience or with friends, will know persons that have had some challenge, let's say, in their relational lives. And it might affect how they feel about themselves. Likely that if we can begin to affect healing there, it's probably going to affect the way they imagine who God is and how God feels about them, and vice versa. If a person is, let's say, working with a spiritual director or working with his or her pastor and begins to alter, let's say they've gone there because it's really hard for them to feel close to God or to feel God's love in the way that they read about. And if that person and the pastor or the spiritual director make some progress, it's very likely that that's going to have consequences for not just how they feel about God, but it's going to have immediate effects in terms of how they feel about themselves and their relationships. That part is kind of obvious when we take it from the positive side. So these are the three key claims that I'm moving from now as we talk about sexuality and spirituality. So when you think about sexuality, if we'd have had more time, I'd probably do this bit by bit and we'd build our own definition. But you know that that term is a biological one, and then it's also cognitive. That terms of, if we talked about how fetuses develop, that our sexuality is a whole lot our brain in terms of hormones and so forth that are triggered there. It's also historical. I was surprised to learn that the term heterosexual and the term homosexual are both early 20th century terms. We didn't have those terms before. Who knew? But this is also the way we think about sexuality. If you think about the ways it's described in Hebrew Bible in the Old Testament, clearly there were some different ways of thinking about sexuality than we do now, or even if we think about Puritans or Victorian era. So our social contexts significantly shape the way we think about sexuality. And it's also fluid. We're beginning to understand now, as persons feel freer to talk about their sexual experience, realizing perhaps some of you know someone who earlier imagined themselves with a particular sexual orientation, and they begin to think, well, maybe that's not. Or maybe my attraction is other than I thought. So it is not necessarily as in stone, so to speak, as settled as we thought before. So I'm trying to get the next, here we go. So much for my success on that. Here we go. Part of what I want to talk about in terms of sexuality is the way in which our ideas about it are constructed. They vary across time. And so I've already illustrated that. If you were to go back to, say, Victorian era, or you read about the Puritans when they settled this country, or you read, if you think about, some of you are close to my age, and so you can remember the ways we learned about sexuality and the way we think about it now are quite different. So that illustrates, I think, in a way, how the ideas about it vary across time. They also vary in terms of context. In the ways that persons learn about sexuality, talk about it in other geographical locations, is also different. Well, one of the ways you might, and James Nelson, the theological ethicist, talks about this too, sexuality from a pastoral care perspective, and in some ways a theological one, is a language, it's our capacity for a language for communicating our love for others, our attraction to them, for intimacy, which most Christians, and certainly Scripture, suggests is a gift, God's gift for us, the Creator's idea. So one way to think about sexuality is as a language for relationship. So maybe this gets close to Valentine's Day. It's also a kind of energy. It's this impelling us to be in relation. Probably the fundamental ethical claim in Scripture comes early on in Genesis, that we're created in God's image, and that is a profoundly relational claim, that we're created to be with. So part of sexuality, not just sexual practice, but attraction just generally to others, is related to this energy that calls us into the relationship God wants us to have. Certainly theologically, we talk about sexuality as a gift, as a distinctive aspect of creaturely life. And in a way, that's more than an evolutionary claim. I mean, obviously, in calling life into being, there needed to be some way for life to continue. But I'm not sure it needed to be as much fun as it is. So one of the things, that I think of it, that I think we can claim, is that God meant for this to be a gift, to make life full of joy and happiness and well-being. So those are important claims that are part of Christian theology and Christian faith about sexuality. Gender is different than sexuality, right? Gender, now we're talking about the rules and roles for how we are men or women. And this, too, is socially constructed. When I think about the way I learned back in the very early 50s about how to be a girl, and I think about how my niece, who's now 20, I guess 24, how she imagines what it means to be a young woman, it's like night and day. And I don't think I'm the only one in this semicircle that would say that. I think that illustrates how this is a very socially constructed. I think if we had time to ask Dr. Mambo how, within the context of Kenya, families engender their children, invite them to think about what it means to be men or women, boys and girls, we'd probably hear some different stories there. But part of what I'm underscoring then is this is not in stone, what these things mean. Rather, it's quite variable across time and geography. And even in our own lifetimes, we can think about that, how our understandings of what it means to be, what's appropriate for being a female, or for a woman. Female would be biology, gender would be woman or man. That's really changed. And part of what I want us to do tonight is also think about how gender has been structured in stereotypical ways. If you think about it, there are very clear roles, and if you step out of them, just think about the trouble you get in. if you behave as you shouldn't. I can still remember my grandmother correcting me. I can remember in elementary school, there was a boy that was more effeminate, if we think about social mores. And I knew early on that it was okay to be called a tomboy, but it wasn't okay to be called a sissy. Do you get the drift of how these stereotypes are powerful? So we're going to talk more about stereotypes in a moment, but for now I just want to list that part of the reality of gender is that it shapes our experience of sexuality. It's very powerful, and it's highly politicized. It might be the best way to put it. It's typically a binary. You're either one or the other, and they co-construct. That is, they co-construct each other. If we know this person is a woman, or saying that you're a woman, that implies something about who a man is. Or, in other words, masculinity and femininity are intersect. They're not defined sort of separately, but to inform each other. That's what I mean by they're co-constructed. We're also learning that these rules and roles for men and women, boys and girls, vary across class, socioeconomic class, and race. This is not something for a while that was as clear, partly because people that wrote and scholars didn't pay as much attention to other than the dominant culture. But we are learning this, and it's really important to be aware of the ways in which these rules and roles vary, because we can make assumptions that don't really match. Oh gosh, what happened? Yeah, okay. And then, I guess the other thing that's obvious is how these rules and roles are insinuated with differences in power. Just think about the kinds of debates we have in the church, we have in culture, we have in school, about appropriate language for inclusive language. Think about the fights we have about that. Or realizing how important it is in textbooks, in the books that children read, to show girls' roles and boys' roles both as lively and positive. We all know those kinds of struggles. Can somebody nod, right? I mean, so that part of what I'm lifting up is this is kind of contested territory. We know this. So it's important to pay attention, though, to how fraught these ideas about gender are, because they really complicate our experience of our sexuality, since gender shapes it, shapes how we experience it. So you've got a handout, which I want to ask you to look at with me. Do they?
Yes.
Okay. This is an idea by a guy named Joseph Pleck, obviously. And he wrote it particularly in a book on masculinity, but I think it's clear that it's operative more widely. So just think with me about this for a minute. Part of because I think this helps us to understand how powerfully distorting these stereotypes about gender can be. Because a stereotype is unfulfillable by anybody because it's a type. So gender roles, he says, are operationally defined by these stereotypes and norms. And I've mentioned earlier, some of these norms, you can have violence, people get killed in this culture if they violate these norms. Sometimes there's that kind of violence. It's a life or death matter in our culture now. So this is nothing to play around with. Gender roles are defined by stereotypes and norms, and these norms are contradictory and inconsistent. That is, sometimes if you think about, all right, a woman needs to be at the same time a loving and nurturing mother, and she needs to be, these days, also an effective, employed, successful in whatever career. Both of those, that can be, especially if she's trying to do all of that, that can be contradictory in terms of how you pull all of that off. This is where sometimes they are contradictory or inconsistent in terms of how can you meet all of these things. The proportion of individuals who violate gender norms is high, precisely because it's hard to be everything. And violating these roles leads to social condemnation. We've already talked a little bit about that. But violating them or trying to fulfill them can have really negative consequences when you try to meet these norms. So actual or imagined violation leads individuals to work hard to overconform, if you will. You might think, I remember a conversation I had in a class early in my teaching career where there were several young men who had been in prep schools before they were in college. And their parents, probably especially their fathers, had really wanted them to play football. Neither of these young men were big. And they talked about how terrified they were to go out for the football team, but how important it was that they do it. So to my mind, it was an illustration. I'd never really been in that kind of conversation where a young man had been that honest with me before, but it wasn't an option from their perspectives. They had to do it. In terms of father's expectations, the culture of the school's expectations, but they didn't have the physical frame. So it was a scary thing. I don't know whether any of you in this circle have had that experience, but it was powerful to me in terms of how severe the consequences might be, and they were willing to put themselves physically at risk because they knew how important it was, partly for family reasons, partly for their peers. And I've already illustrated with that painful difference between, I was a tomboy, but it never cost me anything to be called that, or hardly ever. But it's obviously a much different thing for a boy to be called a sissy. And we know that. I mean, I don't know if that when I was growing up, that was the language. I don't know what the language is now, but you know what I mean by how different the challenge is. And sometimes the gender rules and norms can have dysfunctional consequences. If you think, for example, about eating disorders and girls who, and now also young men, who really develop eating disorders in order for their bodies to look a certain way, because they feel such pressure to conform to certain images to be a successful young or teenager of one gender or the other. And this is wide in our country. I don't know if it's in Kenya, is it? Yeah, so it's or we think about girls who put themselves at risk in terms of dating and acquaintance rape or abuse in a relationship, because it's so important from their perspective in being a successful young girl to date and to feel that they are attractive and popular. And that's part of the pressure also of what does it mean to be a successful young woman in our culture. So sometimes part of what Pleck is trying to illustrate here is how problematic these roles are, not to get into the kinds of debates that think about the challenges for Bishop Shorey in the Episcopal Church in the United States as the first woman bishop elected. Think about the chance tearing apart not just heterosexuality and homosexuality in the Episcopal Church, but for it worldwide, just the election of a woman bishop in the United States has threatened the integrity of the worldwide Anglican Church. So that, you Methodists did that a lot earlier than the Presbyterians did. We finally got to it. But it's still a lively issue. I remember when I was called to be the pastor or associate pastor at the church in Rocky Mount, a family left. And that was difficult. Fortunately, only one, but there were other people that were pretty nervous about it. That's as recent as 30-some years ago. So what I wanted to point out here is these three terms also about gender role discrepancy. So this would be long-term failure to fulfill role expectations. If I think about, for example, some stories in families where, we as parents have such dreams for our children. And often they're related to either something that gave us great pleasure or something we always hoped we could do. So it's not uncommon we really want a son to be an athlete, or we want him to succeed in some other way that's really important to us. Maybe we want him to be a successful businessman as we were. And instead, he's great with computers, or he's a terrific musician. But there's this sense that I was never able to live up to what my dad wanted me to be. And I've already told you about my tomboy years. Fortunately, my grandmother did have a granddaughter that loved to have her nails done, and it was a big help. But I could never be the granddaughter she wanted, to have. I'm sure she loved me, but I was keenly aware that I was a problem in some of those ways. So the failure to fulfill expectations, that's a modest illustration, but the illustration about the young man and his parental hopes might be more difficult. Gender role trauma, and this is where fulfilling the role is itself traumatic. And I could illustrate that with my story about the young men in prep school that were really small guys, but they put on those football uniforms because despite their fears, they knew how important that was for their manhood, so to speak. Other times, fulfilling the role means, let's say, you might be successful, but you turn around and you realize what you've missed in terms of integrity of yourself or relationships, if that meant that your sense of that role was to be particularly successful, let's say, in a field like law that can be so demanding. So you fulfilled what you thought a gender role about being a provider for a family, but you weren't home. And you look back and that family has fallen apart. So this is these are the kinds of pressures that Pleck is talking about and that I'm lifting up in terms of the ways these contested gender rules and roles complicate our experience of sexuality and spirituality, particularly because they can affect, to the extent we're not successful, we're not pretty enough, we're not handsome enough, we're not athletic enough, we're not feminine enough, especially in adolescence, that begins to undermine a positive sense of one's embodied life. And that's part of what I'm going to pick up in terms of how that might affect the way a person experiences spirituality, how you feel, if the only way we know God is through our bodies, and if those bodies have become less, what can I say, less adequate, or they're problematized because our gender, we're not able to affect a positive fulfillment of those gender rules and roles, then we've got a problem. So if we were sitting around, I'd be asking you, what do you think spirituality is? Or what do you think Christian spirituality is? So what I'd like to ask you to do is look at this with me and see maybe there's something we should add. I don't have my keyboard here, so I can't do it. we could have had another slide of just spirituality in general. But when you look at this slide, I mean, when we talk about Christian spirituality, we typically talk about something that is initiated by God's grace, that is, that God has moved toward us in Jesus Christ. So it begins there with grace. And it is intended, spirituality, I think of it as helping us to feel connected to one another in a community of faith, to feel connected to God in our particular relationship. Today we were talking about this actually in another class, and one of the students talked about the communion of saints. That is, that spirituality also connects us with the whole communion of believers. It also connects us to a future story. That is, what our hopes are. Typically, in Christian spirituality, another theme has to do with self-transcendence, that that life is about more than just ourselves. So that it has to do with being able to see beyond ourselves, invest beyond just our own well-being. That we tend to rely on spirituality, or one aspect of it is that it gives us a sense of meaning and possibility. So it links us. Our life is not unto itself, but our story is embedded in a much larger sacred story, right? So hence the theme of meaning in Christian spirituality. And Christian spirituality, it doesn't just happen by accident. It has to do with practices, whether that's coming together on an evening to think and study together like we are, or being in worship, or engaged in many of the kinds of services that I know this congregation does, whether with the homeless or the working poor. So our own prayer, our study. We speak of Christian spirituality also in terms, I've mentioned hope indirectly, but it also isn't the way I know from reading Wesley, which I have done, or reading Calvin, which I have done. There is this transformative impetus to spirituality. It calls us into the world, right, to deepen our life in God and our fulfilling of God's invitations to us. So does that make sense? That it has a transformative dimension to it? What else might you add to that list? Anything? I'm sure I don't have the last word on it.
I like you mentioned it gives us a future, but I think it places you within a much larger story.
Mm-hmm.
It's both history and present and future.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, that's very neat.
I agree. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, well, you may add more to this, but we'll build on that a little bit more. You can see that I'm still learning how to animate PowerPoint slides. So we'll see what happens. Here we go. What I wanted to ask you about was, can you begin to remember how you learned to think about God? Probably in nursery school, I'm not sure. Can you remember how you learned to imagine God and how God feels about you? That's not a rhetorical question.
I think one of the first things I remember, my girls remember, is learning Jesus loves me,
Mm-hmm.
what that means, which is an unconditional acceptance of who you are as a person, no matter what.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So you were in Sunday school?
Yes.
Okay. Song, probably?
Or my parents. I mean,
Okay.
it's probably at home.
Mm-hmm. Anything else? I wonder what they did in the church before that song.
I don't know.
I was raised in a judgmental type home. I remember what a breath of fresh air was when I went to thinking place. Just fully accepted.
Mm-hmm. So your first memories of learning to imagine God were not...
They were judgmental.
They were judgmental. God was like a judging father or, yeah? Watching out don't do this, out to get you, right? Okay? And so it wasn't so warm and fuzzy. It began to alter when you got into a Sunday school environment that was different. Okay? All right? So we have different memories. Anything else? I think part of how...
I'm thinking about it, I'm feeling a real mixed bag of the judgmental, of singing Jesus Loves Me and being told that it's an unconditional love, but it seemed like there were conditions put on it.
Like?
Well, there were always rules, norms, expectations.
Don't get mad.
But, I grew up in a Baptist home, don't drink alcohol, something like that. I mean, now that's later. I don't think that's real early memory problem.
Right.
But I mean, I'm just thinking about, I was taught Jesus loves me, but then I was taught, but
Yeah.
there's some
If you do the right things.
Yeah, there's some conditions to that. And so it's kind
It's
of
a mixed bag, yeah. And do you remember what image of God you might have had? If you were learning to imagine God, what did God look like?
Yeah.
Old man in the sky was what I
Yeah.
remember.
Yeah, I saw cartoon drawings of old man in a white robe, long beard.
One of the speakers we had here not too long ago, talking with him, he had mentioned something that was interesting, that the view that we have of God is heavily influenced by our particular faith that we ascribe to through that lens. And oftentimes the view that we have of God, if we were to apply those same characteristics to a human, gosh, that'd be an awful human. We would not view that person as a good person, but we apply those same values and characteristics to his God. And many faiths paradoxically teach us to look inward on ourselves, to you must do this, must do that, save yourself. They teach us to look inward, whereas Jesus was trying to teach us to look outward. So it's actually this paradoxical view. And we have a lot of challenges as a result of all that digesting down to who's this God. It's kind of self-focused.
And usually, our earliest abilities to imagine God are related to our family experience and close community, because we're also just learning what love means. So, to the extent that we have parents, there's this phrase in psychology about a good enough parent. It doesn't mean that they didn't try. It just means, nobody. I mean, we make demands on parents nobody can completely fill. Do we get, on balance, helpful parenting? Okay, so we're going to, every child typically, and then forming their imagination about God's love, is going to build on that early experience of love in this life. So partly, this kind of ambiguousness that you're describing, all of us typically would have had some shape, because our imagination about God is anchored in this life. It's just the way we learn to imagine. It also may be, as we think about spirituality and sexuality and gender, we might want to think, so most of us also have this idea of God as some sort of father, right? So if there were rules, if there was a disciplinarian in the family, you just might think about ways in which the gendered character of God and the gender rules and roles in culture also become a part of that mix. So we'll just see how that might complicate the mix as we go along.
Well, I think we get that father image from biblical language.
We do. There are lots of...
That's the primary source, I think, of that father image.
It is. There are other images for God,
Right,
but that's the primary one. That's right. It's not accidental.
Jesus prayed to Father. I mean,
Right.
Abba. And So I think we just make that
Right.
jump
As,
to the physical male being in our life.
That's
as
right.
our father.
so then think about, all I'm getting at is that then ties into what are the roles about masculinity, for example. And, when we become adults and we think about our faith, we know that God has no gender. That God is more than or above gender. But you're right. And also it's kind of hard as a little kid to love something that you have to relate to it somehow. But you're right that all through Scripture, that's the predominant image, sure. And then, are there experiences from church life that help you think about God? We've talked about that. Could be nursery school. I also think, at least upon reflection, I was very fortunate. When I was a small child, I was in a small county seat church. So the adults really had to be invested in something. Everybody had a job. I don't know what size it was, maybe 200 people max, maybe 150, I'm not sure. But I do know that they knew my name. When you think about the baptismal vows, and I think the vows that you use in Methodism and that you use in Presbyterian Church are quite similar in terms of the vows that adults make on behalf, along with the parents, on behalf of the child. So part of what I'm thinking about is we also get experiences from church life that help us imagine who God is. So if you're in a pretty fundamentalist setting, that's going to help shape who God is. You can't run in church. You have to behave in a certain way in church. At least when I was little, you did. So there were, again, this wasn't exactly a fuzzy place all the time. So and then what sorts of events? This is a real question. What kinds of events may, over time, have affected changes in the way you think about God? Education? So how might it have changed the way you think about God?
Well, I was raised in that conservative environment in West Seminary.
And
that was very traumatic.
what sort of seminary did you go to?
I went to a Methodist seminary in
Okay.
Chicago.
Yes, so that would have been different. So, so traumatic in the sense that it altered what you had learned, so kind of uprooted things. Right, right. Kind of fruit basket turnover then. Yeah, okay. So you went through a period where everything was on the table and you were reconstructing it.
Yeah,
Okay.
I was getting the message, don't go to higher education at all because Jesus is coming. That's a waste of time to get an education.
Okay, all right. How about others of us? What experiences, what things might have changed the way you think about God?
At what point?
Oh, that's a part of the question too. Well,
I mean, we're talking adolescence, we're talking young adulthood, we're talking
yeah.
later,
So
I mean,
it's an ongoing process,
Yeah.
right? So when you think about and how we think about ourselves changes over time, right? Too, as we begin to have our own autonomy, or we begin to so part of what you might be lifting up is to the extent that how we think about ourselves and how we think about God are related. I don't know what it was like, but I know for students at Bright who come from a more conserving tradition and come to Bright, which is not particularly conserving, that can be a very tumultuous time. And they likely go through, am I being faithful? I mean, what's up with this? Can I go home? Who is God if God isn't like that? And so in other words, it's not just an intellectual enterprise, right? When you begin to entertain these questions. I don't know if, in terms of like in adolescence or in young adulthood, where we're also freer, especially young adulthood, to make some decisions we might not have made at home, but that too might begin to change. Well, do I go to church or don't I? And do I have to keep all the rules? What happens if I don't keep all the rules that I used to have to keep? What will God think of me? You're still, yeah, okay, well, good. Yeah, but...
I mean, that stuff is so ingrained in us as children. I think that many of us don't realize how deeply that stuff is put within us. And there's still that little bit of struggle that, and I want to go back to number 2, experiences from church life that help you think about who God is. I think for many people in this circle maybe, the experience was of a male pastor.
Right.
And so, and I mean, you talk about a close identification with who God is
Right.
Particularly as a child.
Right.
I mean, well, that must be
That's right.
God, not really, but I mean.
How'd you know that was my next point?
At least God's spokesperson.
That's right.
And so, when I got to seminary, the big challenge for me was female pastors. And I didn't really have a problem with that because I've had. But let me explain that. I've had some very strong female personalities in my life that were kind of take charge people, including my mother, who, when my father died, was
She had to take charge.
very take charge, but my grandmothers, I mean, there were some people that, some females that had
In a positive way.
in a positive way. But I mean, they were sort of struggling to find. Well, they're very influential people in my life, particularly, but they bucked the expectation
Right.
of gender role.
Your mother would have had to.
Yeah.
Right, right. But your point is well taken. So think about, for you, there was this symmetry for a while with this language about God and male leadership.
Right.
Think how that also shapes the girls your age who were in that church in terms of who God could be, but also then what did that mean for them in terms of their value? Because there is a certain line between if God is male, that clearly is going to put guys a step ahead. I mean, that's not a logic that's hard to follow. And because certainly in adolescence, and there are plenty of adults who think God really is male. So there's a certain hierarchy there. So your point is well taken, that it begins to affect the way you imagined yourself as a young man, and it affected the way women your age and little girls in the church were imagining what that meant for them. So that's part of what I'm getting to in terms of how spirituality and sexuality get linked, in terms of how we value ourselves, let's say, as young women. Yeah.
Well, and the complexity in his case of a very successful mother bucking the gender role, raising 3 children, running the ranch, and yet believing that women should not be in ministry because that's what
She's been taught that, right?
You have this strange paradoxical mix of gender
Right.
stuff going on.
I get that. And, I'll tell you a funny story. The church the seminary where I taught in Louisville had a large supervised ministry program, so field education. And there was a small church in southern Indiana where it just happened for several years they had a woman student. So this little girl, she gets to be about 5, and they finally have a young man student. And she said to her mother, "Mom, I didn't know men could be ministers." But think how it affected her, because as she was growing up, she saw women in the pulpit. I remember when at the church in Rocky Mount in North Carolina where I was, when a young mother came in and she said, "I have to tell you, I overheard my daughter in the bathtub baptizing her dolls." But that's a cute story, but it has another meaning in terms of how those little girls' sense of themselves was changed in church. And it may seem small, but it does affect how you imagine yourself in the world and how you imagine yourself in terms of how God feels about you. if you think you're a second-class person. And you think about the language and you see, so who makes the decisions in church? Or who makes the decisions in government? I mean, you look around. So part of what, as we grow older, we're looking around and we see, we take in where authority is placed. This is part of what I mean by how these gender rules and roles are fraught with power, with who has authority, and especially in terms of this language about God, language in the church, and hymns and so forth. So as we grow up, in some ways, some biases might be deepened as we continue to take in. And then in other ways, you have this contrast that we have to figure out how to make sense of. And as both of you know, some persons would have had those experiences and become more solidified in the original, more conserving point of view. So thank you for your observations, because it really helps to illustrate what I was talking about. So let me ask another question. I know these aren't easy questions, but this isn't rhetorical either. Can you remember what were some of the influences about how you learned to feel about yourself as an embodied person? Who taught you how to feel about your body? I'm not asking for intimate details.
My parents gave me this horrible cartoon book, and the people were having sex, and they were in the bathtub and all this other stuff. And I remember
She offered this.
but it was a very young age, and they didn't want to deal with it, so they handed me a book to explore. But it was interesting. We still joke about it in our family. We have not given it to our children. Yeah, it was. But that's how I
Were
first.
there words?
Yeah.
What were the words?
I'll tell you later.
Good.
I'll bring it up here someday.
Yeah. But even before that, in terms of ways people care for our bodies, help us get dressed, do you remember ways you were...
Being touched and hugged appropriately as a child, watching my mom and dad hug each other.
Yeah.
The love,
Right.
bodily expression of love and touch and warmth is such a gift.
That's certainly what we hope for, isn't it? And so people holding us as children and respecting us and helping us to feel loved. That would certainly be one of the ways we would feel loved. People dressing us up for church, probably. So that would be another, just watching how adults care for each other, like family, how your parents, your relatives pick you up, hold you carefully, keep you safe. You're learning things about your body and their bodies. So think about school, adolescence. Were there ways that we began to change the way we feel about our bodies? I did.
Get to a certain age, and you start noticing that everybody's body is different.
Right.
In the 2 to 3 range, and that you have different parts than someone else, and what that means.
Yeah.
And then they start separating them too, oftentimes.
Right. Can't be in
in
that.
school.
You can't
You
change
pick
clothes in
up
the same
on it,
room.
you can't
Right.
go in-
So you know something's up.
Yeah.
Seems like everything you said, as far as the social norms and mores that we follow, those are all underneath that bigger.
Yeah, we're learning how to feel about our bodies. We also probably get some lectures about our bodies, how to behave. And we might see how bodies are, we might also pay attention in church, because there probably were some conversations about how you behave, depending on what sort of Sunday school you were in. But I guess what I'm also thinking about is in adolescence, as we begin to pay more attention, your point is well taken, that might be another place where those rules and roles pick up. Because all of a sudden, a body that seemed good enough before isn't. Because there's some particular way it has to look. And of course, nobody's does look like that. But that's a fact nobody notices right? That's my point about these stereotypes. Because they're types, they can't be met. So they're always elusive. So you can never be thin enough. You can never be muscular enough. You can never be willowy enough. A Barbie, yeah, who's sick. But especially as a teenager, my goodness, that's important. And you just don't notice that nobody can meet it. So how you feel about yourself, I'm not good enough, it begins to, and it just, I'm simply pointing out that likely has some feelings about that I'm just not good enough in general. I'm trying to point out the ways in which this gets complicated. We're also making decisions about our own faith. Our minds are beginning to work differently. And it does put people at risk, especially if you're not good enough or you're trying to prove that you're man enough, you're macho enough, or you're attractive to men. You may take risks with your bodies that don't make sense and that have lifelong implications, which could then also affect how do you think God feels about your embodied life. So this is not an easy time in many ways, including spirituality. Part of what I wanted to move to a happier angle on this, maybe, if we think about how we imagine God, how we might imagine God differently, part of what I wanted to lift up was the way in which positive experiences of embodied life, also, it's just as you were illustrating about watching your parents and seeing the love they had for each other, and that included physical expression, of paying attention to how this too can be a lens on how we think about God. So, just think about how good it feels when you've done some exercise, for example, for those of you that run, for example, or work out in some way, and there's a certain high to that. I've done it now and then, I know. You do too. So it feels good. Or just the touch of friends, and the way in which that has a power to it that's more than just the words, that holds us in joy or encouragement, or what it feels like to fall in love, or the pleasure of sexual intimacy, relational warmth, physical closeness. These are, what I'm trying to underscore is the way in which embodied life is a gift and a lens by which to imagine God's intention for us. Because I'm not sure many people make that connection. They might know, gosh, what a gift this is, but not make a link to, this is something God intended. This gives me a clue about who God is, that God wanted this for us in human life. Does that make sense? To think about, how many of you have been blessed with being parents? Okay. How do you think you know something different about God by the gift of those children? Just of when they came into this world? That's not a rhetorical question. Can you go back to that? How do you think that impacted your own spirituality, your own sense about who God is and the character of God's love? Is that too intimate a question?
No, I think it shows that you're vulnerable. I mean, that vulnerability is a wonderful thing. That first day when you hold them and you realize there's no way they can survive on their own, and that they depend on you. It's the same type of feeling that I think we have in relationship with God.
Okay.
Nancy, I watched that over 35 years, and I did a lot of weddings for young people, younger people, and we're going to come to church, Pastor. First baby comes along, and suddenly they're back in church, And I watched that for 35 years. When that baby gets there, I mean, life changes. It's a lot more serious now, and I better get God into the this somehow, because I've been neglecting that. And so I think we do imagine God differently just through that gift of that child.
Just holding that child.
Holding that egg become a real person, and it's just a.
And you had a hand in it. I mean, you had a part in that.
I mean,
Yeah.
It's an amazing.
It's a miracle.
And so, I think we all stand in wonder of that.
Mm-hmm. It's just an illustration.
Yeah.
But what I'm trying to lift up is to not let it go past in terms of a window. It teaches something to us about God's love. I mean, I don't have children. I'm an aunt. But I can remember holding those children and the joy I take in them. And that's a particular, it's certainly just the gift that they are in your life and I also have a godchild. I was just with her last weekend, and just her delight in being alive, in seeing the world through her eyes, it gives me it widens my imagination for God's love. That's the best way to put it. And part of what I am encouraging you to do is to pay attention to those moments. I remember, I have a friend, of course I have many pastor friends, like some of you who are clergy, but I remember her saying she was surprised at how many people, especially single people, but older, would really want to hug her as they were leaving church. She was commenting on that, and I said, well, you might be the only person that touches them for a week. And she really hadn't thought about that. But it's true. So partly it's just the joy of, they didn't do it just out of need, it was also pleasure. But we're built, if you will, we're put together to want that. That's part of what that eros is. It's not just eros for attraction to someone with whom we're going to be intimate, but it's also to be with. And I mean, the skin needs to be touched. So, but it's not just a physiological thing, I guess is but theologically what I'm trying to affirm is that paying attention to that widens our imagination about God's love and God's intention for pleasure and joy in our lives. And that's what really drives me in trying to make this connection between spirituality and sexuality and trying to heal where especially those problematic gender rules and roles might distort or complicate the possibility of imagining in sexuality God's love as opposed to more problematic experiences, I guess. When I think about, for example, as a pastoral counselor working with folks who had experienced abuse, well, that's not just a relational experience. That is going to have consequences for, typically, it's going to be harder for a person who's had that experience to imagine God's love as easily as someone who hasn't. Well, that's a clue to me. It's not just how did this happen, but it affects the way we live in our bodies. And hence, again, my proposal that the two are linked. So maybe you've had some experiences where there's holding a child or of falling in love or being with good friends that where you're able to be close that begins to give you some ideas about God's love. Has that been an experience for others of you? Oh, surely. Well,
I'm getting old enough that I just don't care anymore.
about what?
Some of these roles, gender roles.
You mean gender rules and roles?
I'll hug some men,
Mm-hmm.
my friends.
Mm-hmm.
I'll hug them.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's okay. Man, growing up, that wasn't going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
single ladies, you know, widowed ladies and what have you at church. I mean, I'd stand at the front door and greet people after church, and man, I had to give a lot of hugs. Well, I learned to do that with great joy because it may have been the only time that week that lady got touched by somebody. And so I had to be careful about how I did that. But, you know, I was intentional about seeing certain people each week and giving them a hug. But now, you know, I'll give a guy a hug.
I think things have gotten a little easier in culture
that's
too.
where that gets kind of fuzzy there. There's some people who just wouldn't, I mean, a handshake's about as far as I go with a man, you know, that's about it. But
I think that's also illustrative of how powerful the rules are,
yeah,
how powerful homophobia is in this culture.
Right.
But I think it also, from what we've been talking about tonight, it also illustrates how difficult, if one does identify either in transgender or as a homosexual, how complicated spirituality can be if you're surrounded by assumptions that is off, that's outside of God's intention. So I think it's pretty obvious there how sexuality and spirituality can be distorted by those cultural rules.
the word that's sticking in my craw tonight is expectation. You know, we're overstepping some expectations that people might have about gender roles. You know, men don't hug men. Men can't love men. Men can't love women. Or, I mean, those are expectations that we might have that we've grown up with, and yet when we step over that line, it muddies the water. I mean, it creates problems, like you're saying. And I think it does. You know, you mentioned the abuse thing. I'm glad you brought that up because, you know, God forbid, but it happens. You know, pastors abuse children. Well,
Pastors abuse adults too.
yeah, well, and adults, but I mean, you know, you grow up and I was molested by my pastor. I mean, you know, what is the Catholic Church going through right now with their priest and what have you? And so it's really powerful, you know, in a person's life and particularly how they image God as a result of a relationship that was distorted.
Those distortions are also pretty powerful. I've worked with a lot of women who experienced a pastor who took advantage of them, right? The way to put it, or abused them. So it's also for an adult. Again, this is someone who's supposed to represent God, and
Morality.
yes. But I guess what I'm getting at is the symbolic dimensions. It's not just you. It's a representative of God that did it. So the complications for spirituality in that case are obvious. I think you can see how that would be the case. Jenna, you wanted to jump in?
I was going to just say, I think generationally, though, gender roles are much different than they were, in the different generations, too. I see that they've shifted a lot depending on which generation you are within.
I think you're right about that.
And so I think there's a lot more, there's generational expectations in each generation about gender roles that is different and better in some ways, but I'm not saying better or negative, but it's just,
I think the restrictions are not as powerful.
Yeah.
There's more room for
breaking down.
leeway. I mean, there's a range of behavior that can be appropriate, and there's a wider group of that. I mean, there's also still plenty of hate to go around. Obviously.
You mean I don't have to vacuum the floors and cook anymore?
Yes, you do.
Oh,
Every day. Yeah, it's good.
On the other hand, Nancy, I grew up as a pastor's daughter, a pastor that loved his word and had a good ministry, and I felt so valued and loved in the church growing up. I still
that's how we would want it, right? So it might be that then for you, it's a little easier to make this linkage between a positive sense of being valued and physically cared for and valued, and that this is God's intention. It's just, for some folks, that isn't the way it works. And then it gets complicated. Or, I think especially given the way various interests distort, gender rules and roles might be complicated in any case, but they get so overburdened or laden with other political dynamics that I think paying attention then to how complicated that can make, if we think about adolescents who are at the same age beginning to think about God for themselves. And so they're negotiating all these very challenging images and relationships and sometimes scary experiences in terms of trying to be, they're little adults, right? Or they think they are. So they're all really scary stuff sometimes that happens around embodied life. And they're trying to think about who God is. And part of what I'm getting at is especially, I think, for adolescents and young adults, this can be a very challenging time for positive spiritual experience and who God might be, and their physical, their embodied lives. Does it make sense to you all? How those, especially at those moments.
60, 70 years ago, growing up in a small town where there was only one race, and I'm talking about in the north of the country, not in Texas. One race, basically one religion, not denomination, but basically everybody was Protestant. Very, very different from anything now. We had a concept of ladies and gentlemen, which, where the words actually had meaning. And ladies were different from gentlemen. There was not unisex anything. I guess people from my generation are definitely having a bit of a hard time with current thinking. I personally have accepted most of it, but it's still my upbringing, still influences my thinking.
Sure, of
Still
course.
have a lot of difficulty with I really don't know where I'm trying to go with all this, other than just to point out that it was so much different than
Right.
what we have now.
Right. And I appreciate you doing that because it is the experience of many persons, and still for many persons. Can you jump from where those rules were really clear, and for many persons, this is what it meant to be a man, this is what it meant to be a woman, and I'm thinking that maybe there was also some then clarity about this is who God is. These are the kinds of ways you would describe who God is. Would that be right? I mean, that, given that we're trying to make those connections tonight.
I have a hard time going back and making those connections because we were not, I didn't grow up in a religious family.
Ah, okay. Okay. Well, I would think, because we could have been in church in a similar time, there wasn't much question about what pronouns you used for God and what attributes you would describe God. God would get described in ways that were very similar to the masculine role, right? God the Father, and with parallel,
I also grew up in a matriarchal family.
So that would have been interesting.
at the time.
Sure, sure. It's matriarchal in the sense that was your father present, or
Oh, yeah.
but it's just the women have more responsibility or power? Is that what you mean by matriarchal?
In our family, my mother went through, realized my dad was born in 1898.
Okay.
In a very rural farming community. Nobody went to school beyond.
Probably 8th grade or something.
My mother went on to what would now be called community college.
That's pretty good in those days.
Yeah.
Early 20th century, yeah.
And so when I was growing up in the 40s and 50s, still at home, going to high school, for all practical purposes, my mother was the head of the family as opposed to my dad.
Because she could have a different kind of job than he with an 8th grade education.
I sat here this evening just, what in the world are all these people talking
Right,
about?
I bet.
People haven't had these experiences.
Maybe not of where we were talking about changing norms around gender, although you've observed them and you're still trying to make sense of that. But I think you, upon reflection, you do know the ways in which, well, I guess, when did you become involved in a religious community or a community of faith?
I'm in second year in high school. The girl I had my eye on was big in NYF. I became
So that's how the Methodists got you. I would guess that the ways you had imagined gender and sexuality were a comfortable fit in that Protestant congregation at that time. There wouldn't have been any stresses. And as a man, it wouldn't have presented any difficulties either to have the imagery about God that you had. So that was my hunch is then it wouldn't have posed some of the challenges that we were talking about in terms of, but if you had been a girl, it might not have challenged you, you would have just assumed this is the way the world is, right? But it was, you're right, and it's hard to imagine that 60 years ago, it could be as so different than now. I mean, that's really not that long, right? So it is difficult when you think about, that's just one thing that has changed in the span of your life and mine. But it's a pretty big change. Yeah.
Even in my work environment, I've been retired for almost 15 years now. Feminist movement was certainly beginning, and we got to the point where people of my age group, the guys in our, well, I was an engineer, young women that came in were they had a hard time with our actually referring to ladies and gentlemen and
Yes, ladies and
holding
gentlemen.
the door or any of the things that we thought of as normal. We got ridiculed for it. Yes, it's been a
Yeah, there were, some of those years were challenging. It's true. People trying out new ideas. You're right. I can remember some of that. I can remember going to a seminary, and I think there were 5 of us in a class of 70, and some of the faculty still didn't think we belonged there, which was a little tricky. But I can remember when I told my parents I was going to go to seminary, my father just thought I'd lost my mind. After that, I mean, eventually he was glad, but it was a pretty big jolt. He couldn't imagine it. So it's hard to absorb this much change, I think. So I appreciate you raising that. It is a lot to think about. But I would encourage you to think as you can, to reflect on how your images of God, how your ideas about who God is may have evolved, even apart from your reflection about it, as conversations about gender and sexuality have evolved over the span of your life. Just to test out whether anything that I'm saying clicks at all with your experience. Thanks again for sharing. That was a lot. Appreciate it. How about others of you? Got a few more minutes before you turn out the lights. When you think about how you pray, how you image God when you pray, how do you think there might be a relation between your experience of yourself as an embodied person and the way you imagine the God to whom you pray?
Constantly expanding. I'm at a spot now where, as I try to encompass God as a God of unconditional love,
Mm-hmm.
how to pray for 7 billion people at the same time. And realize that maybe that prayer is as effective as praying for one person. If God is what I think God is.
I do think there's a, if I'm tracking with you, you're as you widen your reflection about the human community, you're recognizing that there's a parallel in terms of the breadth. Even how will you imagine am I getting that right? How to conceptualize this God, whose love could be that big.
Just can't always.
It's kind of hard to get your mind around it, right? I think for myself, living into a freer way of imagining what is possible for me as a woman, and what I hope for, say, for my niece and my nephew as they live into their lives, or the students who I teach. It's not like 7 billion, but it does loosen. It invites me to not necessarily, how can I put this? I think my images for God are more flowing or wider or more open, I guess is how I'm trying to put it. There's fewer boxes. And as there are fewer boxes in my experience of myself, and ways that can be faithful, then I do in myself experience what I'm suggesting to you all, that there's a connection with a loosening. And I don't mean anything goes about who God is. I have a pretty clear sense of God's commitments around love and justice and so forth. But there isn't a freeing in terms of how I imagine God's presence. That might be a way to put it. So I wonder whether, having shared that triggers anything for others of you. Yeah.
In my meditation, for a long time, I kind of just accepted some norms.
Mm-hmm.
I had this image, like in prayer and meditation, of
Mm-hmm.
this white male, and well, I imagined it that way. I mean, I was still having a religious experience, but I
Mm-hmm.
found that I evolved, just, I don't know, just experience.
Mm-hmm.
I
So when you could break out of almost a parallel between the boxes in embodied life and a box for God, that your experience of connection with God increased, was enhanced. Yeah.
Just imagine all around you.
Mhm. And so thank you for sharing this. And has that, and then I think what you're telling me is that has opened up your own spiritual experience. So it's worked both ways, right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But it's true.
Yeah, so the connection is part of what you're saying. Yeah. Thanks a lot. I try to experiment with images of God just to see what, and it's kind of freeing to do that. I remember I had a spiritual, when I was in Louisville, a spiritual friend. You know what that, it's just two of us that made a commitment to pray together on a regular basis. And I remember one time she used this image of God. She had this image of God as like, the Russian women are like a babushka, a big, what is that the right word? So it's this big, cuddly, but it was a woman. So that kind of got my attention for a while. Just another way, but it's clearly an embracing, loving, warm God, which is what mattered. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But part of what you're describing is that you gave yourself the freedom to explore a different way of imagining God, and that had a reciprocity in terms of your own faith experience. That's great.
I'm trying to disembody God.
Are you?
If God is neither male nor female,
Right.
and Scripture says God is spirit, and they worship God must worship in spirit and in truth. And I'm trying to imagine God as spirit, which is unimaginable to me. When I close my eyes, which seems to be a somewhat effective way for me to pray, I can imagine God's presence, but it's not an embodied presence. It's just a presence. Does that make sense? Is this contradict?
I don't think so.
I'm the finite being, and God is not. So, I'm embodied, and the only way I can experience God is through an embodied.
Right. I thought.
An embodied state. So.
I think trying to have just one way of imagining God is probably not necessary or helpful.
Yeah.
And we could have a whole nother conversation about The Shack. You remember that book a couple of years back? But I thought part of what was effective about it was the way he skillfully wrote God taking whatever form the person needed at the time, which I thought made a really important theological claim about.
How do we experience God sometimes, particularly if we talk about Jesus as being God incarnate, embodied, then, and we say, well, you were God with skin on for me. You really were God's presence for me in that moment or whatever. We could experience God in an embodied state through another person, perhaps, or a glimpse of God, maybe. A glimpse of grace or an experience of grace through somebody.
Well, and I think that's, as Methodists, what we claim that we're going on towards perfection. If our embodied self begins to reflect that of the divinity, then we're moving towards that which is holy, which I think is our goal.
Yeah, we use different words for it, but we Presbyterians. But yeah, I think were you getting at that? When you mean, maybe I spoke too quickly. So what is the implication of what you were just saying
That
for?
the divine part lives and resides in our
in each
embodied
person.
State. And
Absolutely.
Thus, because of that, we can live out that embodied
Sure.
state as divine and implicate others.
Because we're made in God's image.
Right.
Yeah. Part of I keep trying to see the face of God in someone else. How can I begin to discern how God is present in that person?
And God is.
I know that. It's
How do I experience God in that
So what am I looking for? You know, how do I find love in this? How is this person embodying aspects of who I hope God is? So it's just, that's one other little discipline I'm trying out. Yeah.
I have a friend many years ago that was converted, very soundly converted, because at the lowest moment in her life, she prayed and she felt a hand on her shoulder. And she believed that that was God reaching out. And she became deeply converted. I always thought that was such an interesting, true experience for her. For me, because I was shaped as a child with God as a father, as much as I tried to enlarge my prayer, and many times that's very effective. The other day, the suggestion was that God is a river, and that you can let all of your anxieties and troubles float down the river, but you're looking for that deep calm of the water that is found within you, that also comes from God. And that was a wonderful prayer experience. But I find when I'm hurting or when I'm afraid, that I go back to the Father image, simply because that's been very positive in my life, and that was my earliest shaping. But I have been able to move on to many other images, and just a warmth for the humanity of the embodied thing, a warmth, maybe not a hand on my shoulder, but feeling that there is a warmth there that is loving me, that is touching me, that is lifting me, that is healing me.
Listen to how embodied those images are. Yeah, that's really great.
And I need that.
Yeah, I hear that.
Very, very interesting for you to ask such a wonderful question.
Good. Well, I think it's 8 o'clock. Thank you so much. Thank you for sharing yourselves as you did. I really appreciate it.